Okay, so you probably have a network diagram, and it shows you exactly what connects to what. Your OT system safely separated from IT, a clean line between the field and the cloud. That diagram is probably wrong. The Purdue model's DMZ, the architectural wall critical infrastructure is relied upon for decades, has been quietly dissolving. Industry 4.0 connected things that were never meant to be connected. Field devices now talk to cloud platforms directly. Manufacturing execution systems touch ERP, and most organizations don't know what they're actually running until something goes wrong. We've seen what that looks like. The Danish electrical grid, Colonial pipeline. Attacks that didn't just compromise data, they threatened the operational continuity of systems people depend on every day. In this episode, I talk with Trevor Dearing, Director of Critical Infrastructure Solutions at Illumio, about what it actually takes to secure OT environments when the old boundaries are gone. We get into why your network map isn't enough, and why any firewall rules are a disaster waiting to happen, and how zero trust and micro-segmentation apply in environments where availability isn't a preference, it's a requirement. This is a story about how agentic AI is entering the industrial process control faster than most security teams realize, and manufacturers building tomorrow's OT equipment are only beginning to take Secure by Design seriously. I'm Robert Famosi. This is Error Code.
I am Trevor Dearing. I'm the Director of Critical Infrastructure Solutions at Illumio. So at Illumio, we aim to help organizations to mitigate the impact of an attack. So basically, we do that by containing a breach and prevent it from reaching the most critical parts of an organization, so helping them maintain services.
So before we get started, I asked Trevor how we are going to define critical infrastructure in this conversation.
So critical infrastructure for me is really around the pieces that keep a country running, put it that way. So when we're looking at that, we're looking at obviously things like energy and utilities, potentially high-tech manufacturing, areas like food and logistics, anything that is obviously core to that, which in a lot of countries is defined within legislation. So a lot of countries will have compliance around critical national infrastructure.
Traditionally, compliance is focused on the IT piece of all this, but critical infrastructure is often OT related in that there are devices out in the field that do binary things. Turn on, turn off, keep the pressure at this level or at that. They're not really considered smart devices, yet they have programmable logic. So, are there pieces of legislation around the world that address that?
There is both legislation, because if you look at, say, in Europe, they have NIS2, which is really aimed at defining a way for each of the member states of the European Union to protect their critical national infrastructure. And there's very similar pieces of legislation in Australia, in Japan, all in the Middle East, the US, all around the world. And the key things with this is to make sure that they are resistant to impact. So, for instance, there's most of the regulations stipulate a whole series of different steps that people need to take to be able to make their infrastructure more robust. And I think one of the key things with that is a lot of people get very, very sort of focused on one part or the other of an organization. But what's happening now is that we're starting to see guidance and regulation from regulators that's taken a much more pragmatic approach. It's, for instance, there was a piece that was recently launched by the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, along with CISA and the FBI in the US, plus the Cybersecurity Centre in Canada, plus Australia, New Zealand, the Netherlands, which actually spoke about guidance for secure connectivity within OT environments. And the important thing with that is that it takes the view, which we all should, that OT is not just the arm or the thing that turns things on and off. It is the whole control system that goes behind that. So think about the whole Purdue model, which has been with us for many, many years. And under the new, all the business transformation that's going on at the moment through Industry 4.0, we start to see that becomes much more connected and much more interconnected with each other. And so a lot of the things that were individual systems or boxes or servers or switches are becoming virtualized onto effectively control gateways. And that changes the architecture because we're right at the top of that model. It's now becoming cloud and standard ERP type systems. And then below that, you have things like manufacturing execution systems. And so we need to look at that whole OT piece as one thing, because effectively what we want to do is to make sure that the switch at the bottom is only communicating with the thing that controls the switch, and that is only then communicating with things that tells it to control the switch. And so being able to take a whole series of steps, or a whole series of security steps with that, is the only way to ensure that whole thing stays robust if there is an incident, an attack, or something like that happens.
One thing about the Purdue model that I remember is that there's a DMZ. I think it's like level 3. It's a disconnect between the OT device and the internet. Now the cloud is out there, and that disconnect is, well, it's no longer there.
Effectively, because everything's becoming smarter and more interconnected, that a lot of the things that were existed in maybe layer 3, and and think about a lot of the time in manufacturing, for instance, layer 3 would traditionally be in a factory,
right?
And the control pieces above that could be in the data center or something like that. Because they're much more interconnected, and because the way that applications are architected, that connectivity and that sort of DMZ doesn't really exist anymore. It looks a bit like IT, but it isn't. It's it may look like a duck, but it doesn't quack or swim. It's that sort of thing. So we have to look at the connectivity from the bottom to the top, and then control that at as many places as possible, because it's not necessarily about security technology. It's about the policies that you write. Because if you get the policies wrong, you effectively become, part of the problem as opposed to part of the solution.
Right.
So the policies you write need to reflect the intent you have as opposed to the technology you have. And, as things change, and as we move forward, from Industry 4.0 through, quick zip through 5.0 to 6.0, which is all about agentic AI, those problems are just going to get worse, and we're going to have to make sure that everything we do is absolutely spot on, because any vulnerability in that space is going to get, exploited so quickly.
So speaking to that, I've been in the OT space for quite a while, and it seems to me that we don't really have a publicly available attack to point to. We've had some examples that were later disproved, such as the water purification plant in Tampa, Florida, and other things like that over time, where we realized it wasn't attackers coming in from the outside, but manipulation on the inside. So when we talk about vulnerabilities, say in the OT space, are there real-world examples that are public and that can be pointed to?
There's a number of, especially a number of reports on critical infrastructure, for instance. So there's one in Denmark on the electricity grid, I think a couple of years ago. And there was a very, very good report put out by the CERT group within Denmark about how that attack happened, where it came from, and and again, a lot of the time it's vulnerabilities in security equipment. So, for instance, there was a vulnerability in a firewall that they were using, and they had exposure to the outside world through that firewall, which basically there was this sort of backwards and forwards over about 3 or 4 days of the bad guys trying to get in and the good guys trying to keep them out. And I think that one of the challenges there is, again, is that whole visibility of risk. And so one of the things that is coming up time and time again in new regulation is visibility of risk. So the whole idea of don't rely on the network diagram you've drawn, rely on a map that you can create that shows all the connectivity, and then look at potentially what connections you've got that you didn't think that you had. And that was, that came out of things like, Colonial pipeline as well, and that brought forward the TSA security directive on pipelines in North America. And all of that is about map your connections. Don't rely on what you think is connected to what. Look at what is, understand where the vulnerabilities are in your systems and where the risks are, and then take mitigating steps to solve that. Because so many organizations, whether it's OT or critical infrastructure or whatever, are exploited by things like open RDP ports and open SMB ports and all of these things that are so basic that you have to address those foundational risks before you even get to any of the very smart stuff.
And this speaks to the implementation of a lot of OT devices. There may be protocols and triggers and things that are on by default that don't need to be there and need to be turned off, or were turned off and assumed to be there. And so, to Trevor's point, you should do your own mapping rather than rely on the fact that Siemens or somebody says that it's this way, when in fact in the field it might be working another way.
Yeah, I mean, that's, you hear, and we've had conversations with customers where they've maybe inherited a network or made an acquisition or something like this, and they look at a lot of the security policies, and they have rules like any to any allow with a restricted set of IP addresses, which on the surface looks sensible, but one of the key things is you have to restrict the protocols to what's being used. So is that if this is a scanner in a hospital, only allow DICOM. If it's in manufacturing, only allow Modbus. Only allow whatever protocol explicitly happens to be needed for that thing. You can't have any service to any service allow at any point. And that's quite key. And also, things like only allowing outbound connectivity from cyber physical devices, so that so that someone coming in from the outside can't gain access to it. And so that's where, the need for things like stateful firewalls in that environment becomes absolutely key, because if you're trying to do enforcement on an Ethernet switch, which is like the world's worst place to do it, you have to create so many policies to allow bi-directional communication that the chances are of you making a mistake are incredibly high. So, there's so much that you need to understand exactly what's happening within your environment, then work out what policies you want, and then work out how you're going to enforce them.
So this is something that a standard security assessment would address. Or do you need somebody who's specifically focused on OT looking for these disconnects?
Those things should be part of a standard security assessment. But I mean, the thing is that, as we move, as technology moves forward, and you've always got this race between the good and the bad and new technologies, coming up all the time, is, the ability to be able to map your infrastructure should be almost standard. So if you're looking at, a set of tools where you want to implement policy, the ability to see what's happening needs to be a standard part of that. And if you can't do that, then you've got a problem from the start. And the other thing is you need to get more and more granular in the policies you're creating. So, we talk a lot about zero trust, for instance. And so zero trust obviously came about 15 years ago. John Kindervag came up with the whole concept. And at the time, the only tools we had to do implementation that were firewalls, and trying to do very granular things in a firewall with thousands of rules can get very, very complex. So there wasn't really at that time the concepts of micro-segmentation or ZTNA or any of that sort of stuff wasn't really around. But 15 years later, we now have that capability. And even if you go back 5 years, the idea of doing explicit policy within an enterprise organization because of thousands of applications was just, so difficult. But when we look in the OT environment, because we explicitly want things to communicate, then applying that, proper zero trust based explicit policy becomes really sensible. And again, when we start to move towards the whole bucket of AI stuff, that's only going to get more important.
Let's bring AI into the conversation. How is Trevor seeing it in the equation?
The key is it's going to take control of a lot more of the operational side of things. So, we have to think about AI as there's two parts to AI. Well, there's many, but two main parts. So there's Gen AI, which we all use to do cat videos and stuff like this. And then we have Agentic AI, which we see advertised, on the TV, everyone's got an agent and all that sort of stuff. But from a critical infrastructure perspective, so from a utilities, energy, manufacturing perspective, it's going to take control of a lot of those operational pieces. So again, the objective with Agentic AI is to make a lot of that process control much simpler and much better. And a lot of that comes through learning. So you'll still be sitting at your ERP console saying, okay, this week I'm gonna manufacture burgers or something like this. And instead of a lot of the step processes that go in between, the AI system will be able to sort of go, oh, I know what to do with that. I can make this, and I can do quality assurance, and I can do all of those things. So you'll still have the sort of normal sort of learning, inference, serving tiers, but the inference and serving piece are probably going to be on site and maybe on-prem. So they may be in your own servers, which is slightly different to how other the sort of SaaS systems work and things like this. Because you don't, a lot of people won't necessarily want that to live in the cloud or something like that, and it's impractical for it to do it. So, so the ability of it to react is going to be so much quicker. But again, all of those pieces need to communicate in the same way, because it's still computers and networks communicating. But a lot of the time it's slightly more powerful, and there's more DPUs, and there's more, all this sort of stuff. And so the bad guys are adjusting the way that they're building attacks to be able to use a lot of those resources for their own agents and AI tools to be able to, improve those attacks. So again, we've got to really make sure that we do all the basics very well. We've got to make sure we understand, we see the map, we see what's communicating, we see where the risks are. We build the policies to only allow explicit communication. So the protection is all the same. It's just we're doing it on the next generation of systems, on the next generation of processes. But the basics of what we should be doing will be exactly the same.
So I see this as kind of a fork in the road, where you could either choose to go after vulnerabilities in MQTT and Modbus or whatever explicitly, or you could focus on the AI piece of it and worry about MCP and poison data lakes and things like that impacting your services. Does Trevor agree?
I don't necessarily see that as a fork, because yeah, I mean, the vulnerabilities in things like MQQT and all of those things are pretty well known. So we know, we can work around that. Um, I just think that the AI piece will just add a bit more to it. It's, as I said, it's still computers, it's still applications. It's just they're just working in a slightly different way. Which is a big generalization, but I know, but but the reality is that again, get the get those fundamentals right, and you're going to be halfway there.
So there are industries that are moving faster in adopting agentic AI in their systems.
It's almost part, sub industries. So there's certain. I mean, it takes a long while to make those changes in the energy sector, for instance. So purely because the scale and sizes and the cost of what they're dealing with, there will be parts of AI will come into that. Whereas if you're in high tech manufacturing, it's probably an easier step. So we talk to manufacturers who are still doing things the way they did them 20 years ago, and haven't really made steps forward in that direction. But when you get into like pharmaceuticals, some automotive, those sort of areas, they tend to adopt that new technology because it's time is money, and the more efficient they can make that sort of thing, the better. So it does depend, and there are certain industries moving forward, and there's certain countries moving forward than others, because a lot view it as a competitive differentiator. So if they can move quicker into AI, they can move forward. So we're seeing a lot of that in the UK, in Japan, in Korea, and places, those sort of places.
We spoke earlier about regulatory controls on these critical infrastructures. I would imagine that this is a blind spot at the moment because AI is moving very rapidly. Are there controls in place or mentioned that at least are thought about in these regulations?
I've not seen them in that area that explicitly call out AI. But what we are seeing is, as I said, is much more guidance from regulators on how to protect OT environments. And because there's two things. There's a lot of the sort of regulations, a lot of the compliance is moving from like tick boxes to much more of a, describe how you're achieving this aim. And that can get a bit fuzzy. And whereas as we sort of move forward, there's a shift in mentality there towards a bit more prescriptive. So for instance, DORA, which is a banking regulation in Europe that is sort of starting to affect everyone on the planet, because anyone who deals with Europe in the official hands with this is much more prescriptive about what to do and how to do it. So, and we're starting, as I said, to see guidance coming from the regulators, and guidance always precedes regulation. And a lot of the guidance is much more prescriptive about how to secure your OT environments.
I'm curious about something Trevor said a moment ago about some of the industries that he's talking to are doing things in a way that they've done for the last 20 years or so. They're motivated to improve their security posture because they see things turning around. Or is it just, I don't know, you're coming to them and saying, why aren't you doing this today? You could be doing it so much better. I'm curious, how do these conversations actually come about?
A lot of it comes from we may be at, it's a passing conversation that could be at an event, a trade show, or something like this, and we'll talk to an organization and say, oh, what are you doing to solve this problem? They go, well, actually, we haven't got that problem because we're not at that point yet. So when I say they're doing things like 30 years ago, then they haven't automated things yet, or they're still got people doing stuff. And which is really interesting, and that can be regional as well. So you tend to see a lot more of that in parts of the US where there's a lot more traditional sort of heavy industry and stuff like that. I mean, you think about it, we talk a lot to organizations that make paper, and when you're when you're planning where to put your paper mill, what you do is you start off by planting a load of trees and you wait for the trees to grow and then you put the paper mill there and then that stays there for 100 years and then and then you move on. So, so there's certain industries that even though the control systems are quite sophisticated, the actual processes are, have been the same for 100 years. So what you see a very sort of hybrid environment where it's a bit like, think about you're taking a very old, Boeing 747 and putting the latest avionics in it. It's still, a 50-year-old Boeing 747, but it's much smarter because it's got, more efficient engines and it's got better avionics and better controls. So, there's stages that some people are like, quite a way back. And as I said, when you look at industries like energy, where it would take a long, long time to move that forward, then they've got their own challenges in that migration. And it's always transformation actually causes a lot of the problems because they're finding new things happening that weren't there before.
I guess what I find interesting about such conversations might be the idea of, you often think of security companies as being reactive. They're coming in after a breach, they're coming in after a situation, and they're showing up what's already there. This seems like greenfield in that Illumio is coming in early and are saying, as you automate, you should be thinking X or Y or Z, and you have to reinterpret your security in a certain way for the modern world.
Yes, and that does happen sometimes, that the more forward-looking organizations are saying, right, we're doing this transformation, how do we secure it? Because they may have been sort of affected by an incident in the past. But so many times, the problems that organizations face and why they spend lots of money and to a certain extent can't necessarily stop all of the attacks is that they end up reversing security into the transformation. And this is, and again, this is a classic where organizations have looked and thought, oh, we've got you've got Wi-Fi and we've got Ethernet, and we can just plug it all together and it'll all be great. So they've got CCTV cameras and PLCs and all sorts of things plugged into these networks or connected wirelessly. And then the security guys go, what have you done? And they then end up having to sort of work out patchworks of how to solve this problem. Whereas, a lot of the time, if there was some, thinking about, right, okay, these things need to communicate with this and nothing else, so we just put that on its own Ethernet switch, then a lot of those problems would have been solved before they get there. So, a lot of these issues that organizations face are because decisions made by other people haven't been sensible. I spoke to one of the, a huge manufacturer, household name, and we were talking about enforcement on Ethernet switches. And then they went, oh, we've got some Netgear and we've got Linksys and we've got this huge patchwork of things that some are managed and some aren't. And, you get this area where someone's taking a decision to put a thing on an Ethernet switch without thinking about how industrial that Ethernet switch is. So, there's all sorts of challenges created by organizations going through transformation, doing things that they think is right without necessarily considering security implications that go with it.
Then over time, with acquisitions and so forth, you've got a patchwork of different systems. But then I've always argued that the diversity of those systems is actually a security strength, because you can't attack the entire network. You can only attack pieces of it, given the structure, as opposed to a homogeneous network, where you've got one type of device across everything, and once you're in, you're in.
I think it throws up its own challenges, because, again, if you through acquisition or through whatever process, these things need to communicate together, and you've got to be able to create that view and understanding of how things are working, and if you've got a patchwork of devices and systems and things, that may become more difficult. So the great thing if you've got a greenfield, it's easy to map all the connectivity within that organization. It's easy to see what's going on, and then it's relatively easy to apply policy. If you've got, things from like 2 or 3 firewall vendors, and you've got, different systems doing different things and different security, trying to create and monitor that policy is quite difficult. And then also, because one of the key things that's popping up in a lot of guidance now, and recommended, is how do you build an isolation plan? So what do you do? So when you detect an attack, how do you effectively ring fence and isolate your, the minimum viable operation within your business, and effectively then identify where the things have been compromised and then isolate them? Trying to do that with a mix match of different technologies is quite difficult. And so, that's one of the reasons why, if you can ignore the infrastructure and sort of build your micro-segmentation model irrespective of the infrastructure underneath it, then you've got a better chance of doing that. So it all depends on where you're doing your enforcement and the policies you need to build.
So what is Trevor seeing in the field that's interesting today?
I guess probably one of the interesting things that's happening now is what the manufacturers of the technology that people use are doing. So, in a lot of countries, there is legislation that says a manufacturer of a piece of technology that is used in energy or a manufacturing process, whether it's a wind turbine or something like that, has to be secure from a cyber perspective. And the response to that is variable, I think, at the moment. But the more that people, the more that there's a standardization on how those systems work, then I think we're going to move forward, because what we want to avoid in the future is the legacy problem we've got now. So you go and talk to an organization in any critical infrastructure industry, and they'll say, we've got Windows 10, and we've got Windows 2012, and we've got all of this sort of stuff, and we've got this PLC that's controlling this thing that is so out of date that no one knows what operating system is running, and the company that built it has gone out of business, etc., etc. So all of that stuff. And so one of the important things now is that more and more systems are coming out that are standardized on, they have a virtualized system that runs Windows and Linux, and it will run whatever the latest version of Windows and Linux is because it's sitting on a hypervisor, or it's containerized. So, so there's a big step forward there, and we're starting to see, more and more PLCs come out with standard PCIe bus. So you can put a PC card in, you can put a smart NIC in that does all sorts of clever stuff. So you can get a smart NIC from NVIDIA, for instance, with a DPU on there that you can run all sorts of different security technologies. So I think all of that is a huge, huge step forward in being able to then build a security infrastructure within your, within CNI. And the only challenge then comes when manufacturers start to get very protective about what security technology can be installed on that system. And that's a problem, because, especially you've got, issues in healthcare where, for instance, you've got a scanner or something like that, and it's approved by the FDA, certified for the FDA. But if you want to install security on it, you have to get it recertified and redone. So there's some sort of a whole series of issues that still need to be addressed to make individual systems more secure, as opposed to the whole environment. So there's things steps that probably could be solved quite quickly in a couple of years to improve that sort of side of things.
Trevor mentioned a little bit of a resistance there by some of the vendors. But in general, would you say that most are open to bringing security into their devices?
Yes. Yeah, I think they are. And what's interesting is, some are, some aren't, but every day it's more and more. And I think that's because, to a certain extent, their customers are pushing back on them and saying, what you're giving me is good, but from a security perspective, it needs to be much better. So, whether that's valves, wind turbines, PLCs, robots, whatever it happens to be, they need to be much more robust, and they need to be able to a certain extent, support standard security technology. And, there's no way we're going to install EDR on a PLC because it's just going to slow the thing down to a grinding halt. But there's, certain things we can do around, configuring the standard firewall and, all of those sort of things that just will help improve the situation.
I'd like to thank Trevor for coming on the show and talking about defense strategies for securing critical infrastructure in the age of AI and what building resilience in 2026 involves. Hey, if you're enjoying Error Code, tell a friend. I'm sure there are other people out there who like narrative information security podcasts. And I'd really like to hear from you. Go to errorcodepodcast.com to get more details. And tell me what you like, and even what you don't. I've got some great episodes coming up. We'll have more on Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, and hacking utilities supply chains. Subscribe today. I don't want you to miss out.